In the beginning of this week's parsha, we have 5 karbonis that are mentioned. These are the karbonis, the oila, the mincha, the chatos, the osham, and the shlomim. Each one of these, the Torah starts off with saying zois toiras or vis zois toiras, which simply means these are the laws of this particular carbon. However, the Toiras Koyanim and the Gemara say that we learn out that the word zois toiras is coming to add something. That means that the laws that say about this particular carbon are going to apply also to other cases of that carbon, some cases which we wouldn't have thought on our own that these laws apply. So by the oila, what we learn out, zois toiras oila, is that in many cases, things that go up on the Mizbeach, even if they shouldn't have gone on the Mizbeach, we don't take them off, we leave them on the Mizbeach. So too when it comes to the other categories, when it says zois toiras ha-mincha, we learn out that even menachos, that doesn't say clearly that they need to have oil and levoina, we're speaking about menachos, a carbon mincha, flour offering, that's not eaten by the kohen. In other words, the Torah says that oil and levoin are added to the menachos that a kohen gets to eat part of it. But there are certain menachos that a kohen does not get to eat part of it. Nevertheless, we learn out from zois toiras that there too oil and levoin are added. When it comes to toiras hachatos, the toiras kohenim says that all chatois have the same halacha in the sense that if the blood of the carbon chatos sprays on someone's garments, those garments need to be washed, even though it says it more specifically about the carbon chatos that sprayed on the outer mizbeach. Nevertheless, the same law applies. We learn out from zois toiras for the carbonis of the inner mizbeach. From zois toiras ha'asham, we learn out that all carbonis asham, the blood is sprinkled on the lower half of the mizbeach. Again, there's a certain asham that we would have thought otherwise. That's the asham of a mitzoira, because there's a pasuk that compares the asham of the mitzoira to a chatos. Now, a chatos, the blood is sprayed on the top half of the mizbeach. Nevertheless, from zois toiras asham, we learn that all hashamois, the blood is sprayed on the bottom part of the mizbeach. And finally, when it comes to the shlomim, we learn out that the laws of zman, of time in relation to a carbon, that means noisar, you're not allowed to leave over after a certain time, you're not allowed to have in mind that you can eat it after a certain time, also apply to a bama, that means even to the private kind of mizbeach that was allowed at certain times. When it comes to Rashi, we find something that seems to be very, very strange. For the first two, for the oila and the mincha, Rashi explains exactly like the Toiras Kohanim what we're learning out from it. When it comes to the last three, those are the chatos, the asham, and the shlomim, Rashi doesn't say anything. So make up your mind. If Rashi thinks that we do need to learn out something from Toiras, why doesn't Rashi tell it to us for all 5 of them? If Rashi is of the opinion that you don't need to learn out something from Toiras, why does Rashi tell it to us when it comes to the oila and to the mincha? So the Rebbe in Seif Gimel gives a suggestion that you may think that maybe the Rashi is relying that the Talmud will figure those out by himself. And the Rebbe goes into a whole thing over here that the only reason then, if the Talmud would figure it out by himself, why is it that Rashi needs to explain by the mincha? So Rashi told us the oila by the first one, the klal, the general idea. The last 3 is relying on the Talmud, so why doesn't he rely on the Talmud by the second one? So the Rebbe goes into a whole thing over here, that over there may have been a reason that the Talmud mistakenly would have learned something else out of it, as the Gemara does, but according to Rashi that wouldn't fit, because according to Rashi that really cannot be learned out from this pasuk zois toiras, because according to Rashi that particular halacha that the Gemara learns out, which is that kohenim get to eat also from karbonis, that doesn't say specifically, according to Rashi this is something that we learned out already from Parshas Vayikra, and therefore Rashi needs to tell us what we do learn out from the carbon mincha, the zois toiras. But the Rebbe is not happy with this, because the Rebbe says if that's the case, Rashi told us already what we learned out from zois toiras mincha, so there's no need to tell us that we shouldn't learn that out in this case. And more importantly, the Rebbe goes through each one of the karbonis, why it's very difficult to say that the Ben Chomish Lemikra would figure these things out by himself, what we learn out from the words v'zois toiras. And therefore, the Rebbe takes a different view on the whole concept. And what the Rebbe says is that we need to understand that v'zois toiras is understood in 2 different ways. The simple pshat of zois toiras is these are the laws. There's no need to learn anything extra out of it. But that only makes sense to say if this is clearly the place where most of the laws are going to be taught, or all the laws are going to be taught. When it comes to the last 2 carbones that are being discussed over here, those are the carbon Osham and the carbon shlomim, these are dinim that were not discussed in Parshas Vayikra. So Zois Toiras, therefore, means simply these are the laws of these carbonos. You don't need to learn anything else extra out of it. However, when it comes to the first three, the carbon oila, the mincha, and the chatos, these were clearly things that were said already earlier in Parshas Vayikra. Most of the dinim were said already in Parshas Vayikra, and therefore only in regards to those three do we need to learn something out of it. And Rashi gives us the first two, the oila and the mincha. This is because these are things that we wouldn't have figured out on our own. What's the extra thing to learn out of it? However, when it comes to the carbon chatos, although again, Toiras cannot be understood by the carbon chatos, that these are the laws, because most of the laws were taught already earlier. But a carbon chatos, Rashi doesn't need to say it, because here it's a very, very simple thing that we learn out of it. Rashi actually doesn't have to tell it to us. And what is that? The law that says right afterwards, the one law that it says about the carbon chatos, is the fact that it needs to be shechted in the same place as the carbon oila, which is in the north, in the tzafon of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan, and so on. So the pasuk says that all the karbonis chatos have to have the shchita in that place. I would have thought that there's one carbon that should be excluded out of that. And that is the carbon, what's called the carbon oila v'yoyred. The carbon oila v'yoyred is a carbon that a rich person brings a sheep or a goat. A person that can't afford as much brings birds, and a person that can't even afford that brings flour. Says the Rebbe, here is a carbon that I would have thought does not need to be shechted in the tzafon. Why? Because shchita might not even be necessary at all in this particular kind of carbon. You may be bringing flour where there's no slaughtering, there's no shechting at all. So in this case, yes, the Ben Chamish Lemikra could figure out by himself if this is the one law that the Torah says right after the words V'zois Toiras Hachatos, then clearly this is something that we're going to be learning out, that all karbonis chatos need to have the shchita b'tzafon, even the one that I may have thought otherwise. The Rebbe then goes on to explain why by the carbon mincha we wouldn't have been able to figure it out by ourselves. The carbon oil is the first one, fine. So that I wouldn't have even known the idea, so Rashi has to give us the first example. The Rebbe goes on, why by the carbon mincha would have I not figured out that the oil and the levoina needs to be done for all the menachos? And the Rebbe explains, just because the whole concept of the oil and the mincha is not even mentioned over here, it's back in Parshas Vayikra, why would have I thought that that's what's coming to be added with the word V'zois Toiras, in addition to the fact that the whole mincha of the koyanim that we're trying to add with it is only a later parsha, which is completely separated with a new Vayedaber Hashem to the Parshas mincha over here, so it wouldn't really fit that I should figure out by myself that the oil and the mincha, that should apply to the mincha of the koyanim, and that's why Rashi has to actually tell it to us. So in summary, really, what the Rebbe did over here was, again, the carbon oil is the first one, and Rashi tells us clearly what we learn out from it, Zois Toiras, because most of the laws were said earlier, so it needs to be that Toiras is adding something. When it comes to the second one, to the mincha, it's something I wouldn't have figured out by myself about the oil that needs to be added. Rashi needs to tell it to us. By the carbon chatos, again, this is something that Rashi doesn't need to tell us, but it's clearly coming to add something because most of the laws were all said earlier already. When it comes to the last two, when it comes to the Osham and the Shlomim, Toiras means simply these are the laws because we didn't learn the laws at all. It says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we see there's two categories that are being told to us and added in our parsha. In the first categories, we're speaking about new dinim that are being added. Those are by the carbonis oila, mincha, and chatas. So it's new dinim being added to a carbon that we know of already. The Rebbe calls this eichos, there's some quality being added to the carbon. But then there's quantity, there's new carbonis that we didn't even know about before at all. These are the carbonis osham and toida. And the Rebbe takes from this dohira that when we speak about adding, in our avodah and so on, it's not only, we would think, eichos usually, spirituality usually goes by quantity. Physical things go by quantity, but here we see there's an importance also in adding to the quantity of the carbonos. And this is coming to tell us that yes, there's a concept that we take from our gashmias, from the quantity, and making that into eichos, into quality, into ruchnias. And in a more general way, this is also speaking about being makarev more and more yidden, even yidden that chas v'shalom seem to be on the apostle level, that are going up and on the mizbeach that we would think chas v'shalom to remove them and so on. It's really just the opposite. We need to bring every single yid more closer to Yiddishkeit and more kamus actually adds more eichos, and by us being mekarev other Yidden, we ourselves gain in our quality as well.